Hello Internet, I'm the Disney Brain, and thanks to the combination of Netflix and at least 2 other countries scooping Nickelodeon, before then hilariously dropping Nickelodeon, the entirety of Power Rangers Dino Fury is available for everyone. Consider this the spoiler warning, since this will, of course, be a review of the entirety of Season 1. And unlike much of the Saban brand's lineups of yesteryear, there is legitimately things to spoil about how Dino Fury's plot proceeds, for better and for worse. But before we dig into the big important details, let's ease into things first by continuing on from where our previous conversation left off. And that means it's time once again to talk about lore. Dino Fury inherited a quote-unquote problem, insofar that it can even be called that Beast Morphers laid the groundwork for with regards to intermittent lore integration. Sometimes it found a way to work, and sometimes it's just a toothless twist that derails the story. And while I still think that at the time of making that sort of mid-season review, Dino Fury was legitimately looking like it would fall more to the latter side, I was pleasantly surprised by how much restraint it had on that mark towards the back end. For now, anyways. The fact that Zed is not only back, but is also arbitrarily tied to Ion's destiny does not bode well for Season 2, regardless of how accurate or not those leaked plot points are, none of which will be discussed here, for the record. But you might think that given my stance there, I'd find Zed's return in that initial context to be jarring and silly, and in many respects it was, but surprisingly, I actually really liked that episode. In fact, the more I thought about it, the more enamored I was with what they did here. Discussing why digs a bit into Ollie as a character, since he finds himself at the center of proceedings, but we'll dig more into him later as well. So we know that Ollie is primarily defined by his overly blunt and overly pragmatic sensibilities. He isn't keen on ideas that don't operate under the logical constraints he imposes on himself and tries to impose on others. Said logic is normally heavily flawed, and several episodes have their fun at the expense of his mentality, but I think his characterization works in this specific rubber meeting the road moment. A moment where the so-called most logical ranger of the bunch comes face to face with a roided up version of one of PR's most dangerous foes and immediately wants to throw hands. And in that moment, none of his softly built walls of sensibility applies. It's kind of been a recurring recent trend with Rangers, but primarily of Blue Rangers, where there are these more emotionally laden moments that successfully break through their calm and collected exterior, and suddenly, there's a real human in front of us. Worth noting is that the framing has to support this too, otherwise you get just awful episodes like Going Ape. So while a lot of people will loudly scream about how out of character it feels, I'd always counter with how neat it is that said characters have different sides to them, sides that force us to see them as conflicted, three-dimensional people that we can't always predict. And I especially like it for a character like Ollie because of how it challenges him specifically. That, and it's also hilarious to me that there's a montage of what is ostensibly Zed's greatest hits, but it's several of his least impressive plans treated with complete straight-faced seriousness. That's the kind of lore-mongering I don't mind, because it runs as loose and as absurd as the season it's in. Season 2 could easily upend a lot of that, but as far as this season goes, Dino Fury's need to remind us that MMPR definitely exists doesn't detract as much as it could have, and if anything, it's the random assortment of references to other seasons that raise more of an eyebrow. Now I'd like to get a bit more broad and discuss the general atmosphere this season creates. One of the things Dino Fury emphasized that the last 4 years didn't as much is having the main characters do more to carry the lighthearted comedic tone of the show. And because of that, characters like Zato especially, but also Izzy and even Ollie from time to time, feel like very active participants to that end. So while I think certain elements of the character writing this season go really overboard really fast, and we'll get there, Dino Fury was at its best to me entertainment-wise when they could just let Ollie be an absurd asshole for no good reason, or let Zato embrace his dorky dad sense of humor, or even let Ion simply be his hilariously irresponsible self. It's an element they continued to lean on over the course of the season that, perhaps fittingly, made the crew feel more aligned with the last group of Dino Rangers. Even with Jane and Jayborg still assigned to the role of comedy duo, I found their presence more enjoyable than most characters in that same role, perhaps because it felt more par for the course. This, as directly opposed to how Ben and Betty's failing upwards, feels odd through the nepotistic lens it operates under, because nobody else can get away with making that many mistakes, namely Zoe, maker of many mistakes, who gets religiously hounded for them while, uncoincidentally, having no solid upper crust connection to lean on. But to return the focus to Dino Fury, J-Borg especially is a really neat character. I've mentioned this in previous videos, but it bears repeating. Her robotic nature being treated as a given and not as a means of othering her is a nice detail, even if her alleged Hartford origins begs more questions than it answers. But it's interesting, because for as weird and non-committal as PR's relationship indisputably tends to be with beings who either can be or have been marginalized, they usually get robots pretty right, Beast Morpher Season 2 notwithstanding. And perhaps that's because there's no real-world history there to lean on. So when PR does its pseudo-post-racial utopia thing through various mechanical life forms as opposed to humans, any positive reception can be framed as having actually grown past prejudice, as opposed to forgetting it existed at all. Even though sexism and classism are still rampant, but again, weird, non-committal, and inconsistent on top of all that. But my point is, J-Borg and the lack of uncomfortable implications surrounding her felt reminiscent of one of Megaforce's best traits. And I think, even with limited screen time, it was much smarter to heed the example spearheaded by Robo Knight and Rico as opposed to Beast Morpher's obsession with biological humanity. All this to say that, in general, when any given character in Dino Fury was given the floor to shine, they tended to come off as pretty charming and genuinely funny on both sides of the conflict. Steel and Roxy being standout characters the last 2 years ended up being the blueprint for what we see here, except now there's just more of that to go around, and I for one am a fan of that direction. Which leads us to the rest of the cast, and through them, we'll also expand upon pretty much all of the season's major plot points, since almost every relevant plot point is character-centric. Since we started with Ollie, let's continue with him. I don't think he's got a super notable moment beyond what the Zed confrontation speaks to, but Ollie is just hilarious to me, because the show just keeps letting him be an out-and-out asshole. Almost every episode he's focused on involves being a dick to someone, apologizing for it, then some 3 episodes later, doing it all over again. He's such a weirdo he straight up keeps the likely stolen laptop he won from Slither's fake contest and never gives it a second thought. While none of this paints Ollie in the greatest of lights, he's also far more entertaining than he would have been otherwise. Early on, I questioned what the show would do with him, because we've seen his archetype done countless times, and their solution was to have him solve a geometry equation while poor Javi is just trying to do his job. And so long as Ollie isn't thrown into subject matters that would necessitate a much more careful approach, then I unironically hope that just becomes his thing forever. And hey, he hasn't gotten the chance to ruin Ion's day yet, so there's still some avenues to explore. Talking about Amelia, by contrast, is a lot more difficult, mainly because the level of importance Buzz Blast as a setting ended up having was far less than the opening episodes might lead one to believe. And despite the fact that it's a place of employment for both Amelia and Javi, it's treated as more of a juice bar type of locale than a place where business happens. Ollie got to sort of carve out an identity for himself beyond his hilarious antics by way of his tech know-how and the mother that taught it to him. Likewise, Izzy's athletic pursuits are well integrated into the show, both in action choreography and in the day-to-day plot points. But despite Amelia's predisposition to her job, supposedly, there's not much we see from her that feels specifically tied to her passion for it, save the McScary Manor episode. But even then, the show leans a bit more into Pop-Pop's natural inclination towards making every scene he's in a precious one. Javi runs into a similar issue, though one that is clearly more intentional, because like Amelia, he too is forced into playing a second fiddle role to a family member that the script loves a considerable amount more. Like most of the cast, I found him awkwardly charming in the same way I found Calvin awkwardly charming 4 years ago. But at some point, this show really needs to address how horrifyingly bad Warden Garcia is. The writing routinely brushes off his sociopathic tirades by not really forcing him to come to terms with the lessons his children learn. We're meant to think his insistence that Izzy should come in first place next time is a resolution, but it isn't. It's a blatant disregard for the circumstances at play that flies directly in the face of the episode's entire point. And here we're meant to just ignore the fact that he guilted Javi into not doing enough to protect his sister, all while he vanishes for however many episodes just as stubborn as before. Javi can get the memo and open up as much as he wants, but his initial inability to do that has an exceedingly clear source, and it's one of several character details this show didn't quite consider enough, though there's at least an easier avenue to salvage that next season. But thankfully, I think Izzy is spared on that front, save however much Father Dearest serves to detract from her character, which isn't nearly as much as Javi. I'll basically be repeating myself here, but I still very much adore Izzy. Tessa Rayao gives consistently good performances in her role, her focus episodes tend to be strong ones, and overall, I just think the show knew what to do with her and how to position her a lot better than anyone else in the cast. So much so that even the milestone that Izzy's sexuality represents feels like just a bit of icing on that cake. Since, and let me be clear about this, LGBTQA plus representation does and should matter. But Hasbro knew they could get away with doing just a fine job here because I suspect they didn't really have to bargain with Nick for this in the same way Korra's creators had to. 7 years ago. But maybe Izzy and Fern being just this cute but not especially notable relationship is, in and of itself, a sign of progress. I'd be a little out of my depth as an ally, but by no means a direct member of the community this directly impacts to comment too much one way or another. But what I can say is, having seen and been a part of the conversation surrounding this, that there are fair arguments being made on either side. And also some embarrassingly intellectually dishonest ones, but we saw that coming. Because on the one hand, Izzy's sexuality feeling like a very natural extension of her character is nice to see. But on the other hand, let's not get too carried away with the Hasbro praise, especially with how late to the party PR is on that front, even in comparison to other child-aiming TV shows and networks. But who I will defend Hasbro from, which feeds back into the intellectual dishonesty bit, are the legions of internet morons who unironically think that Izzy, Ion, and to a lesser extent Zato for some reason, existing at all somehow constitutes as woke branding. Now, this isn't to say that any given company with the chance to use and abuse the progressive social strata we live in won't abuse it. That's capitalism's default setting. But the strides Power Rangers have made towards representation, however earnest they might have been then or are now, started in 1993. So yes, there was a time when they were actually beating their contemporaries in this department, making it even more questionable that it took this long for Izzy to exist intentionally. And it's not like the chances weren't there. So while I really like Izzy because of her stories, unfortunately, there are a few less savory story beats ingrained into this season that created a lot of notable conflicts. To explain what I mean in more detail, we need to dig deeper into the Rafconian Ranger duo. So, as we know, the backstory of both Zato and Ion revolves around their war with the Sporix and how they are the last remaining members of their old team. So on the face of it, they take what InSpace heavily implied about Andros and Zane's past and run with it. But the major reveal that puts a bit of a wrench in things is the realization that the Sporix were actually created by the Rafcons to fight battles for them. What's more, Zato approved of this while having at least some knowledge of the obscene risk they were taking, while Ion spoke against it. And now you can start to see how the breezy humor of Dino Fury runs itself into a pretty thick brick wall with how jarring this twist is. Before now, we had every reason to believe that Zato's happy-go-lucky attitude was not only genuine, but a means of looking forward to ensure that he can protect those counting on him in the now. But his blatant dishonesty about his past by way of omission, on top of him at no point prior feeling any type of way about new people wearing the colors of his dead friends, is one hell of a not good writing choice. At best, it comes off as a spur-of-the-moment backstory tack on with no time to breathe, regardless of who on the production side's fault it is that there weren't any breaths to spare. And at worst, if this was always the plan, then very little about the episodes prior to and after can be contextualized sensibly. There's no chance we were meant to see his dorky side as a coping mechanism to keep himself from being forthcoming with a team in just as much danger as his former one, because PR doesn't do that kind of black comedy on purpose. and there's less of a chance that we're now meant to think, regardless of executive meddling, that every single ranger on this team has zero lingering issues with Zeto's decision making. And even if we could buy into that, despite the spotlight they place on Ion's PTSD later on, are we then also supposed to buy into Zeto just magically being cured of his guilt until the finale? The one part of this that could be looked on favorably is his insistence on finding survivors of his race. Because you can make a stronger argument, relatively speaking, that he can do away with some of his survivor's guilt if he's not the sole survivor. But Ion's return sullies that idea as well, because unlike his memories of his mother or his interactions with whoever Slither was pretending to be, Ion immediately reminds him of both of his biggest failures, and his visible discomfort there informs us that trying to avoid facing his past was probably more important to him than trying to salvage what remained of it. And because of that, Ion was right to call him out, and his team was right to get in his face for keeping this under wraps. But the show was wrong to think all of that could be addressed within the same time frame as one of Ollie's learning to not be an asshole episodes. Though it's Ollie who needs far longer to have that stick compared to anything we see of the Rafcon Rangers. Ion as an individual, removed from the context of his backstory, is fun and entertaining for all the reasons the show itself is. His careless agreement to show off his Zord to ego-inflating strangers is one of this season's best jokes. But his lack of responsibility also lacks some necessary connective tissue, which is tragic, since this episode would have tied in well to his short-lived belief that he should be the leader of the team. But even when that is the actual plot point, it's amazing how the story barely acknowledges how similar his first bit of Earth action is to the nightmare-inducing last bit of the original Sporix War. A war that marks yet another situation where Zeto approved of a dangerous decision for the sake of getting out in front of an arms race. All this likely to further appease his vaguely authoritarian Rafcon superiors who created living, feeling, thinking creatures to use as tools of war. Needless to say, there is a lot going on here that Dino Fury is in no position to speak on whatsoever. And when they do so anyway, it's far too disjointed, far too implication heavy, and far too awkwardly framed to be an effective conduit for building their story, or the characters caught up in it. But I suppose it does technically fit into how the show positions Void Knight as the opposite side of the Zeto coin, since our main villain here is the one far too obsessed with preserving life, while our main hero is written in ways that convey a darkly comical disregard for it. This also gets at a slightly more abstract point I thought about a lot while all of these oddly conceived backstories were being drip-fed to us. The more they dig into all of this, the harder it is to see the Dino Fury Rangers as an actual team. The Nightmares episode is a seamless visual representation of what I mean by that, though I'd be remiss to not point out how weird it is that Ion's trauma is more the focus here, while the show brushes off how Zeto's Ultrazord fantasies ended up costing lives. All while the show lies to us about Zeto having those same dreams, despite none of this being hinted at prior to Ion's revival. The less you think about it, the more it makes sense. But that aside, this episode paints a clear picture, because while the Rafcons are fighting their storied pasts, the others are fighting the more mundane present. Ion was granted a second chance by the Morphin Masters themselves, which ties him to Zed, you'll recall, and Zeto all but has a direct link to them. Both of them are being tied to this greater, wider, impossibly ancient Ranger mythos that the others have no real context for, and in many respects, it's as if Javi, Ollie, Izzy, and Amelia exist in a completely different show. The jovial nature of our resident aliens does not congeal with the nature of their histories, but you can't really make that same conflicted claim about the others. There's a surprisingly deep earnestness within Amelia's relationship to Pop Pop. There's a clear connection between how Izzy and Javi are characterized and how their maniacal father treats them. Ollie has a mom. But neither Zeto nor Ion needed such a confusingly dire and confoundingly quick backstory that puts them at odds with many of the show's better features. And if the staff knew how quick it would have to be, given the mandates forced upon them, they could have just, changed the backstory. But despite all of those criticisms, I think even that can be salvaged. and it's yet another thing teased at by the Z episode. It's something I've touched on before as it pertains to the confused way the Sporks as beings were written, but in light of everything we need to swallow plot-wise, the Rangers fighting alongside the Sporks, I think, would make the perfect endgame scenario. If we're truly meant to believe that Zato actually learned something from his past, then why not have the Sporks fulfill their original destiny? Not because the Rafcon higher-ups decided that tools of war would be a great idea, but because in spite of that, Zato, and by extension the team, come to realize that the Sporks are a lot more than just enemies. Zato is the closest living thing the Sporks have to a father/creator, even if he just okayed the whole thing. And it wouldn't take much for him to realize that they express themselves through a wide array of complex emotions, just like the Earthlings he and Ion have zero qualms about. Continuing to destroy and capture the Sporks won't resolve much for him. But you know what might? Pulling a Wild Force and saying that regardless of the early writing, and regardless of what people did or didn't do that created the orgs, they do, in fact, have hearts. There really has not been a better chance in the past decade for a spiritual successor to Waspicable, or the Duke Orgs, or Weiger, who is played by Void Knight's actor funnily enough, than Dino Fury Season 2, among the many, many other things I really hope they address. I know I haven't talked much about the villains, but beyond how Void Knight is meant to work juxtaposed against Zato, they really speak for themselves, and we'll see how he pans out more when Season 2 kicks in anyway. As far as the others go, Mucus is amazing, Boomtower is great, Slither is everything I hoped for and more, and just like the rest of the main cast, they capture the exact kind of unadulterated exuberance that this show has by the truckload at its peaks. So kudos all around to the talent there, including PR mainstay and friend of the channel, Campbell Cooley, who I thought would be perfect for Slither before the official casting news dropped, and incidentally, Hasbro agreed. Needless to say, I could watch these two goobers get into mischief all day long, and I'm sure once they find their way out of the Doom dimension, we'll get more of exactly that. And bouncing off that presents us with a chance to close things out by discussing Dino Fury's finale. A finale that finds a way to encompass many of the things I both really enjoy and really don't about this season. I like that they revive Boomtower just for the sake of it. I like that the plot escalates in a way where it feels like the Rangers have to collectively think through, and even disagree on, how to carry out their next move. And I especially like how the team barely flinches when it comes to sacrificing their powers to finish the fight. It's just classic, quintessential PR in the way it represents how much bigger the people are compared to the power itself, and how that's what makes them Rangers. But I think some of that is undercut by the fact that Zato is, at long last, meant to be framed as driven by his loss. But it's the same Zato that offers up Ollie's mom without her consent. I'm not really sure what they were going for when the claim is made that it shouldn't be Ollie's choice, and yet the team is scheming up this whole plan before Mother Dearest can make a choice? It's about the last thing Zato of all people should be advocating for. Someone who doesn't want to lose anyone else, but is more than willing to sacrifice a civilian for a tactical edge. A tactical edge that backfired because, of course, he couldn't account for the unpredictability that Ollie warned him about. But crazier than the idea of Ollie finally being right about something is how we're meant to read the aftermath. Ollie basically concedes his very viable point to Zato, purely because the Rangers lucked out on the result. This marks the one and only time Zato's decision-making is questioned after the widespread catastrophe he helped usher in comes to light. And not only is he right to be questioned, again, but he's also being questioned for the same lack of foresight that cost him both his planet and most of his old team. All three scenarios driven by the escalation of the current conflict. It's apparently one of those things where Rangers aren't supposed to be quarreling too long with each other. But if every sizable conflict and plot point isn't allowed even the thinnest of loose threads, what it leaves us with is a whole lot of questions and some pretty grim answers. At least the answers we actually do get. The puzzle pieces just don't fit together here, except when Dino Fury is doing what it does best, and just letting their strongest personalities win the day. And I don't say that lightly. I should emphasize that this show is really good when it wants to be, but every time it tries to jam in one of those plot points that lean a bit closer to that post-Zordon, late Sakura era of Rangers, it becomes basically incomprehensible. In large part due to still being cut inside many of the trappings of Saban Brand's writing, direction, and overall philosophies that, ironically, Sakura himself started in earnest with Samurai. And that's where I'm at with Dino Fury. It's a good show, where its likely well-meaning ambition is met with the laxest of follow-throughs. And with the narrative elements it plays with, I don't think you can go halfway. That's the reason Dino Charge is so special, in spite of it not being really all that different from the seasons surrounding it. It knew what it was, where its strengths were, and only dove into the realms of inexplicable mayhem during the closing 20 minutes. Time Force, by contrast, is a season that leaned a lot heavier on character progression, dedicating themselves fully to Wes's personal relationships. So when you think about how Jen, Mr. Collins, and Eric relate to him now versus how those dynamics started back then, it mostly congeals. Both seasons, 3 counting Supercharge, have great characters, and while the reasons for that greatness diverge heavily, they fit into the context of the seasons they find themselves in. And I wish I could say the same for Dino Fury, because again, it's a really fun ride. And just based on the length of this video alone, it certainly isn't lacking in discussion points. But I also think there was a considerably better, considerably stronger Season 1 that we just missed out on, for one reason or another. So here's hoping that Season 2 can balance things out a bit better. It'll be exclusive to Netflix now, so it's certainly got a chance. So with all that said, I guess like, subscribe, and other such YouTube things, and then maybe my next video won't take another month to come out. And speaking of videos, for all 10 of you who have been asking me to make a Patreon, or have been looking for a way to financially support my work, I now have a YouTube membership thingy going on, which should appear as a join button on all video pages now. Obviously, none of you are under any obligation to become a member, but if you love what I do and feel like tossing me a few bucks every month, you now have a means to do so. So, until I finally crank out another video, thanks for watching.